Today, I want to share with you a story about the boundaries we build around our hearts, and what happens when the world we think we know is shattered in a single, violent heartbeat. It is a story about a woman named Eliza Thorne, and the day the golden cage of her safe, predictable life was torn open, exposing her to a destiny she never asked for, but one that would change her soul forever. Our story begins where the horizon feels endless, deep in the vast Texas plains, just as the sun had barely crested over the earth. It was a morning that seemed to promise nothing but the usual stillness. Eliza stepped out of her family's cabin, feeling the soft morning breeze tugging at her hair. The air was thick with the scent of wild sage and dry earth. To anyone else, it was a beautiful, tranquil frontier dawn. To Eliza, it was just another quiet morning, the kind she had known all her life. The Thornes owned a modest ranch near the frontier, isolated, sitting far from the comfort of towns and the safety of the military forts. For Eliza, this isolation was her entire world. Her life had always been defined by a simple, rigid rhythm: chores, prayer, and the quiet, desperate hope that one day she might marry a kind man who would take her somewhere, anywhere, far from this lonely wilderness. She felt invisible, a ghost moving through a life of duty. She didn't know that destiny had a different plan entirely. On this particular morning, her father and two brothers had ridden out to check the cattle near the river, leaving Eliza and her mother alone at the homestead. As Eliza moved through the yard, hanging laundry on the line, a sudden, unnatural stillness fell over the land. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then, it began, not with a scream, but with a sound vibrating through the soles of her feet, the distant thunder of hooves. At first, a hope flared in her chest. She thought it was her father, returning early. But as the riders drew closer, emerging from the dust like phantoms, that hope shattered. She saw the glint of painted faces, feathers, and lances. Her heart froze. It was the Comanche. Panic exploded in the yard. Her mother screamed, a sound that would haunt Eliza for years. Eliza turned and ran for the cabin, her skirts tangling around her legs, desperation clawing at her throat. But the next moments blurred into absolute chaos. The air filled with the shouts of warriors, the terrifying crack of gunfire, and her mother's desperate prayers. Smoke began to choke the sky as the cabin, her home, her sanctuary, was set ablaze. Eliza felt herself yanked backward, her screams swallowed by the roar of horses and fire. A strong arm circled her waist like a band of iron, dragging her up onto a horse. She fought with everything she had. She struggled, kicking and crying out. But her captor held firm. His voice was commanding and low, speaking words she didn't understand, a rough language that sounded like the earth itself. The world spun into a dizzying nightmare as they rode hard across the plains. Tears streaked Eliza's face, and the wind burned her eyes. But she couldn't look away. Every heartbeat hammered with terror. In her mind, she was certain of her fate. She thought she was being carried to her death. They rode for hours, putting miles of unforgiving wilderness between Eliza and the ashes of her former life. It wasn't until the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, that the warriors finally stopped near a river. Eliza was pulled from the horse, her legs trembling so badly she collapsed into the dust. She waited for the blow, for the violence she had been warned about. in hushed whispers her entire life. But it didn't come. Instead, her captor, the one who had taken her, dismounted and walked toward her. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with long black hair and deep brown eyes. His name, she would later learn, was Kaelo. In that moment, however, he was simply a terrifying stranger. But as she looked up at him, cowering, she realized something that confused her fear. His expression wasn't cruel. He reached for a leather pouch and offered her water. Eliza hesitated, trembling. She expected trickery. She expected poison. Yet, she looked into his eyes. There was something in his gaze, quiet, steady, and unreadable, that made her pause. It wasn't the look of a monster. It was the look of a man watching a wounded animal, wary, but not hateful, driven by a thirst she couldn't ignore. She drank. The cool water slid down her parched throat, grounding her in the terrifying reality of her situation. As the tribe began to make camp, the reality of her position set in. Eliza sat apart, her wrists bound, her heart pounding against her ribs. The other men laughed around the fire, their voices rising like wild music against the wind. She could not understand their words, but she felt their glances, curious, assessing, and hostile. She clutched the cross around her neck, praying silently, certain her fate would be sealed before dawn. But Kaelo did not join in their laughter. He stayed near her, like a silent guard. When one of the younger, more aggressive warriors tried to approach her, leering and shouting, Kaelo stepped between them. He spoke sharply, his voice cutting through the noise, until the other man backed off. Eliza watched in disbelief. Why would he defend her? He was her captor, the man who had stolen her from her world. Yet here he stood, a barrier between her and the cruelty of the others. That night, as the stars spread across the sky like a million eyes, Eliza lay awake on the cold ground. Every muscle in her body was tight with dread. Across the campfire, she saw Kaelo watching her. He wasn't looking at her with lust, nor with the cruelty she expected. He watched her with an expression she could not decipher. The ranch, her family, her faith, and her clear understanding of right and wrong, all of it had been torn away in one violent moment. She was now a stranger in a world woven of dust, firelight, and untamed freedom. Fear still owned her heart, absolute and suffocating. But deep within that fear, the very first spark of curiosity began to flicker. Who was this man who took her, yet shielded her? Why did his gaze unsettle her more than his touch ever could? The night was long, and her tears were silent. But as the firelight flickered on Kaelo's calm face, Eliza's hatred faltered. Just for a second, destiny had begun to whisper its strange, dangerous promise. She didn't know it yet, but her life had changed forever. The golden cage was gone. The wild had claimed her. The journey that followed her capture was a blur of dust and despair. The world spun as they rode hard across the plains, the rhythm of the horse hammering against Eliza's ribs. Every jolt, a reminder of her helplessness. The wind burned her eyes, and her tears dried on her cheeks before they could even fall. In her mind, the destination was inevitable. She was being carried to her death. But when the sun finally dipped low, bleeding crimson into the horizon, the warriors stopped near a river. Eliza braced herself. She expected violence. She expected to be dragged down and discarded. Instead, The man who had taken her, Kaelo, dismounted and walked toward her. He was tall, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over her trembling form. He didn't speak English, but as he looked down at her, his expression wasn't cruel. He reached for a leather pouch hanging from his saddle and offered it to her. Eliza hesitated. Her hands shook so violently she could barely clasp them together. She stared at the pouch, expecting trickery, expecting poison. But then she looked up at him. His gaze was quiet, steady, and unreadable. It was the way a man might look at a wounded animal, wary, perhaps, but not hateful. Something in that stillness made her reach out. She drank. The cool water slid down her parched throat. And for the first time in hours, the terrifying reality of her situation came into sharp focus. She was alive, and this man, this warrior, with the painted face and the dark, intense eyes, had chosen to keep her that way. As the tribe made camp, the isolation set in. Eliza sat apart, her wrists bound, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her chest. The men laughed around the fire, their voices rising like wild music against the wind. To Eliza, it sounded like a nightmare come to life. She could not understand their words, but she felt their glances. They were curious, assessing, and sometimes openly hostile. She felt like a ghost among the living, watched, but unseen. She was an intruder in a world she had been taught to fear, a world of raw earth and smoke. She prayed, silently, clutching the small cross she had managed to hide beneath her dress, certain her fate would be sealed before dawn. But Kaelo did not join the others. He did not laugh with them. He stayed near her, like a silent guard. When one of the younger warriors tried to approach her, stepping too close with a sneer on his lips, Kaelo stepped between them. He spoke sharply, his voice low but commanding, until the other man backed off. Eliza watched in disbelief. Why would a savage defend her? The answer came the next morning, as the camp came alive with the smell of roasted meat and wild herbs. Kaelo led her toward a large circle where the tribe had gathered. The air was heavy with judgment. The elders stood there, their faces hard and suspicious. They spoke in their language, gesturing toward Eliza, their tones harsh. She didn't need to know the language to understand what was happening. Her fate was being decided. Would they trade her, kill her, give her away as a prize to one of the men who had looked at her with such hunger? The thought made her stomach twist. She was the daughter of a proud rancher, raised to believe herself virtuous and proper. Now, she was spoils of war. Then, Kaelo stepped forward. His voice rose passionate, urgent, yet firm. He spoke to the elders, his hand occasionally gesturing to himself, then to her. The crowd murmured. The elder chief finally nodded. The meaning of the moment struck Eliza like lightning. He had spoken for her. A young woman approached, carrying a blanket and a carved wooden vessel. She draped the blanket over Eliza's shoulders and placed the vessel between her and Kaelo. Around them, the tribe began to chant softly, the sound rhythmic and deep, carrying a strange power that vibrated in the earth beneath Eliza's feet. Kaelo looked into Eliza's frightened eyes. He spoke only 2 words in English, words he must have learned from traders or battles past. You? My wife. Eliza's world shattered. She recoiled, shaking her head furiously. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. No, I can't. You can't. But Kaelo's gaze stayed steady. He did not touch her. He only bowed his head slightly, almost as though apologizing. The ceremony was brief, more symbolic than grand. Smoke from burning sage was brushed over their hands. When it ended, a cheer rose from the tribe, not loud, but final. The decision was made. She was no longer a prisoner. She was bound, married to a man she did not choose, in a world she did not understand. When night came, the terror returned, colder and sharper than before. She sat in Kaelo's lodge, trembling. This was the moment she had dreaded since the raid began. She was his wife now, by every law she knew, and every law of this wild place. He had the power to claim her. Kaelo entered quietly. He carried a bowl of food and placed it near her. She refused to eat, turning away. Her body coiled tight, waiting for him to reach for her. After a long silence, he spoke in his broken English again. His voice was soft, barely a whisper in the dim light of the lodge. No fear, he said. Not hurt you, not take you. You sleep. He took his buffalo hide blanket and laid it on the far side of the lodge, putting the fire between them. Then, he lay down and turned his back to her. The gesture confused her as much as it comforted her. He had every right to her. Yet he took nothing. Hours passed as she stared at the firelight, flickering over his strong shoulders. For the first time since her capture, her fear began to shift, not vanish, but twist into something she didn't understand. Yes, he had forced her into marriage, but he had also shielded her from humiliation, from the other men, and from death. He was her captor. And yet, somehow, he was her protector. In the days that followed, this strange dynamic became her new reality. Eliza was clumsy in this life. The tasks the other women performed with ease, grinding maize, fetching water, were foreign to her. She felt their eyes on her, judging her weakness. One afternoon, she stumbled while carrying a heavy water skin. The water spilled into the dirt, turning the dust to mud. A group of young men nearby laughed, mocking her clumsiness. Shame burned her cheeks. She waited for Kaelo to be angry, to be embarrassed by his useless white wife. Instead, Kaelo silenced the men with a single, sharp glance. He walked over to her, his movements fluid and sure. He didn't scold her. He reached out and steadied her arm, his grip firm but gentle. He didn't linger, didn't try to make it a moment of affection. He simply righted her world and then stepped back. He was not what she had imagined a savage to be. He was quiet. He was disciplined. And, though she hated to admit it, he was dignified. His presence carried weight, as if the air itself bent to his calm authority. Eliza began to realize that the marriage was a shield he held over her head. He had claimed her not to possess her body, but to save her life. And as she lay in the lodge night after night, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing across the fire, the terror that had screamed in her mind began to quiet. In its place, a question began to take root. Why? Why would this man, born of a world so violent and different from hers, show her such restraint, such honor? She did not yet know that this uneasy peace between them was the beginning of something far deeper, a bond that would eventually test every belief she had ever held about love, pride, and freedom. The silent guardian had saved her from death, but he was slowly, unknowingly, beginning to capture something far more dangerous: her curiosity. Time has a way of eroding even the sharpest edges of fear. As the weeks turned into months, and spring began to spread its green fingers across the vast Texas plains, the terror that had once gripped Eliza every waking moment began to loosen its hold. She still dreamed of home, of whitewashed chapels and lace curtains, but those dreams were growing hazier with each sunrise. In their place, the reality of the Comanche village was becoming a world she could no longer deny. It wasn't the chaotic wilderness she had been taught to fear in the sermons of her youth. It was a place of rhythm, of order, and of purpose. Eliza began to observe. She watched how the women laughed together while sewing deerskin garments, their fingers moving with practiced grace. She saw how the men prepared for hunts with a solemn dedication, and how the children played with bone toys, running barefoot through the dust. Loved and cherished, it was a family. And slowly, almost against her will, she stopped scanning the horizon for a rescue party. She stopped feeling like a prisoner and started feeling simply present. But it was not the village that truly changed her. It was him. The shift began with a fever. It struck her suddenly, a violent heat that left her body burning and trembling. In her old life, she would have been tended to by her mother or a doctor. Here, she expected to be left to the women, or perhaps left alone entirely. But Kaelo did not leave. For 3 days and 3 nights, the warrior who had terrified her became her nurse. He sat by her side in the dim light of the lodge, cooling her forehead with damp cloths, refusing to leave even when the elders called for him. In the delirium of her sickness, Eliza opened her eyes to see him watching her. The hardness was gone from his face. In its place was a worry so genuine it pierced through her haze. When she finally awoke, weak but alive, he smiled. It was a faint, fleeting thing, but it warmed her in ways the fire never could. In that quiet intimacy, Eliza realized she was seeing the man behind the warrior, the soul behind the face that had once haunted her nightmares. Recovering meant spending quiet evenings outside their lodge. And it was on one such evening, under the canopy of 1,000 stars, that he gave her the gift. Kaelo sat beside her, the silence between them comfortable now, no longer sharp with tension. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small object, a piece of bone, carved with painstaking detail into the shape of an eagle with outstretched wings. He placed it in her hand. His fingers were rough, calloused from the bow and the rine, but his touch was incredibly light. "You," he said slowly, wrestling with the heavy, unfamiliar shape of her language. "Heart like eagle, strong." Eliza looked at the carving, then at him. Her breath caught in her throat. Her entire life, she had been praised for being obedient, for being quiet, for being dutiful. No one had ever called her strong. No one had ever looked at her and seen a spirit that could soar. But this man, this stranger from a world she didn't understand, he saw her. "Why do you help me?" she whispered. The question that had burned in her chest for months finally spilling out. He hesitated, searching for the words. "Finally," he said softly, "you not enemy. You lost." Those simple words struck something deep within her. The walls she had built around her heart didn't just crack, they began to crumble. She was beginning to realize that her captor was the only person who had ever truly set her free. But if the eagle carving was the spark, the night of the celebration was the fire. It happened after a successful hunt. The camp came alive with the sound of drumming, a heartbeat that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The air smelled of roasted meat and smoke. Eliza stood at the edge of the crowd, her shawl drawn tight, watching. Then, Kaelo stepped into the circle. She had seen him ride, and she had seen him work, but she had never seen him like this. He moved with a grace she had never seen in a man, his body strong and sure, every motion in perfect rhythm. With the beating drums, sparks from the great fire flew into the night air, clinging to his skin like gold dust. The crowd shouted his name, cheering for their protector, their warrior. But for Eliza, the world fell silent. Her heart thundered in her ears, louder than the drums. She couldn't look away. She felt a heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a sudden, sharp ache in her chest, a longing she had never known. Something wild and impossibly human, she realized, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that she was no longer afraid of him. She was attracted to him. And that was far more dangerous. Overwhelmed by the noise and her own treacherous thoughts, she slipped away. She needed air. She needed the cold bite of the wind to clear her head. She walked toward the river, where the moonlight turned the dark water into a ribbon of silver. She knelt to splash water on her flushed face, trying to steady her trembling hands. Then she heard his voice, Eliza. It was the first time he had said her name so clearly. She turned. He was standing only a few feet away, the firelight from the camp still flickering against his back. He held no weapon. He stood with that quiet, intense presence that always seemed to suck the air out of the room. "You not dance," he said. There was a soft trace of disappointment in his tone that made her heart ache. "I don't belong there," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, slowly, as if he were approaching a startled deer. "You belong where your heart is," he said. The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Eliza looked up at him. She could smell the faint scent of smoke and earth on his skin. She could see the faint scar along his jaw, and the kindness in those dark, depthless eyes. He reached out. He didn't seize her. He didn't command her. He simply reached out to touch her hand. And this time, she didn't pull away. His calloused fingers brushed against hers. The contact was electric, sending a tremor through her body that had nothing to do with the cold. For one suspended heartbeat, the world stopped. They stood there, two people from warring worlds, bridged by a single touch. He looked at her, and she knew he wanted to kiss her. She knew, with a sudden, fierce certainty, that she wanted him to, but he didn't. As though sensing her confusion, sensing the war still raging inside her conscience, he let her hand fall. He stepped back, giving her the space she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. "Good night," he murmured, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary before he turned and walked back toward the fire. Eliza stood alone by the river for a long time. Her pulse was unsteady, her mind a storm. She returned to the lodge and lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She finally faced the truth she had been avoiding. Kaelo no longer frightened her. He stirred something far more profound. She had spent months fighting her feelings, clinging to the memory of who she was supposed to be. But that night, as the drums faded into the distance, she knew her heart was no longer her own. The savage had not conquered her with force, he was conquering her with patience. And she was terrifyingly, wonderfully close to surrendering. The peace that Eliza and Kaelo found was not a soft thing, it was forged in the wild. And it was the wild that finally broke the last barrier between them. It happened during a journey away from the main camp. Scouting the valleys as the seasons began to turn. The sky, usually a brilliant, endless blue, turned the color of bruised iron. A storm swept across the plains with a violence that made the very earth tremble. Rain fell in sheets, cold and relentless, forcing them to seek refuge in a shallow cave carved into the side of a rocky hill. Inside, the world narrowed down to the essentials: stone, shadow, and the sound of the wind howling like a wounded animal outside. They were soaked to the bone. Kaelo shivered, exhaustion finally showing in the slump of his shoulders. Eliza didn't wait for him to act. In her old life, she would have waited to be saved. Now, she moved with purpose. She gathered dry moss and wood from the back of the cave. Her hands, once soft and unblemished, now capable and rough. She struck the flint, her fingers trembling only slightly, until the fire caught. As the amber light bathed the cave walls, pushing back the shadows, the atmosphere shifted. The storm raged outside, but inside, time seemed to stop. Kaelo watched her from across the small fire. His dark hair was plastered to his face, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "You strong," he murmured, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "Not afraid." Eliza looked at him, wiping damp hair from her face. She smiled faintly. "I used to be," she admitted, the truth hanging in the air between them. "I was afraid of you, of this life, of myself." He tilted his head, his dark eyes searching hers. "No fear now." Eliza hesitated, her heart hammered against her ribs, not with the terror of capture, but with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. She looked at the man who had taken her from her world, only to give her a new one. "No," she whispered, stepping around the fire to stand before him. "Not of you." The silence that followed was thick, charged with months of unspoken emotion. Kaelo reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, every chance to retreat to the safety of her anger. But she didn't move when his fingers brushed her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw. Eliza felt her breath catch. Every nerve in her body came alive. She saw in his eyes not command, not the lust of a conqueror, but reverence. He looked at her as if she were something sacred, something he was afraid he might break. "Kaelo," she whispered, her voice trembling. He drew her close. His lips brushed hers, tentative at first. Then, with the desperate certainty of a man who had waited a lifetime to touch what he loved, the kiss deepened, and the walls of the cave glowed with firelight. That night, the storm became a distant murmur. Their union was not one of captor and captive. It was the meeting of two souls who had fought their way through fear, language, and war to find each other. Eliza gave herself freely. In the shelter of that stone sanctuary, she realized she had crossed an invisible line, one she could never return from. She had become part of his world, and he of hers. They were bound now, not by force, but by a love born in the heart of hardship. When morning came, the rain had stopped. The world outside was washed clean, glistening under a pale, innocent sun. Kaelo slept peacefully beside her. Eliza lay awake, watching the light creep over the horizon, feeling a profound sense of peace. she believed, foolishly, that the storm was over. She was wrong. The storm had just begun. It started at dawn, the same hour her life had been shattered months ago. But this time, the disruption didn't come from painted warriors. It came from the thunder of familiar, heavy hooves. Kaelo woke instantly, his body tense, the lover vanishing and the warrior returning in a split second. He grabbed his weapons and ran to the mouth of the cave. Eliza followed, her pulse pounding in her ears. In the distance, emerging from the mist of the valley, she saw them. The glint of brass buttons, the blue coats, the rifles, Texas Rangers. "Kaelo," she cried. But he was already moving, his face grim. He knew what this was. This was not a skirmish, it was a slaughter. The Rangers had been tracking the band, hunting them down. Chaos erupted. The silence of the morning was torn apart by the crack of gunfire. Kaelo shoved Eliza back toward the cover of the rocks, shouting at her to hide. But she couldn't move. Her legs refused. She watched, paralyzed, as two worlds collided before her eyes. On one side, the men she had grown up with, white men, her own people charging forward with hatred in their eyes. On the other, Kaelo, fierce and proud, fighting a desperate battle against impossible odds. Then, through the smoke and the dust, she saw a face she knew better than her own. Eliza. The voice broke through the din of battle, cracking with relief and disbelief. A young ranger dismounted, running toward the cave with his rifle raised. It was Silas, her brother. "Dear God, it's you," he shouted, stumbling toward her, tears spilling down his dust-streaked face. "We found you." Eliza stumbled forward, her mind reeling. "Silas, stop. Please. Stop." But Silas didn't hear her plea. He saw only his sister, ragged and terrified. He grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her behind him. "We're getting you out of here. These savages." He didn't finish, because just then, Kaelo appeared from the smoke. He was bleeding. A bullet had grazed his arm, blood streaking across his skin. His chest heaved, his expression a mask of fury and pain. He saw Silas gripping Eliza, and he raised his bow. "Let her go," Kaelo said. His English was broken, but his voice was deadly calm. Silas raised his rifle, aiming directly at Kaelo's heart. His eyes were wide with hate. "She's my sister." Silas spat. "You have no right to her." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The air grew heavy with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. He was going to kill him. He was going to kill the man she loved. Eliza didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences. She threw herself between them, standing directly in front of Kaelo, shielding his body with her own. "Stop. Don't you dare hurt him," she screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. Silas froze. His rifle wavered. He stared at his sister, disbelief turning to horror. He looked at her wild hair, her Comanche dress, the fierceness in her eyes that he didn't recognize. "You're..." Defending him, Silas whispered, his voice trembling. "Eliza, move. He took you. He forced you." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and false. Eliza stood tall. She was shaking, but her chin was lifted. She looked at her brother, the boy she had played with, the man who represented the safety of home, and she shook her head. "No, Silas," she said, her voice steady now, cutting through the silence. He saved me. Silas recoiled as if she had struck him. They've turned you. He spat. They've turned you against your own people. He protected me when no one else would. Eliza cried, tears finally spilling over. I am not a prisoner. I am his wife. The declaration shattered the last remnant of her old life. She saw the light go out of her brother's eyes, replaced by a cold, hard confusion. But before Silas could answer, a gunshot rang out from somewhere behind the Rangers. The truce was broken. The war had returned. But in that fleeting moment of silence, the truth had been spoken. Eliza had made her choice. She had chosen the storm. She had chosen the savage. And she would never, ever go back. The chaos of the battle faded as quickly as it had begun, swallowed by the immense silence of the wilderness. Kaelo moved instantly, pulling Eliza down, shielding her with his own body as bullets tore through the air, dragging her into the cover of the trees. They did not look back. They couldn't. Behind them lay the smoke of gunfire and the shattered expectations of a brother who could not understand the woman his sister had become. Ahead of them lay only the unknown. They rode hard until the sun hung low, and the world around them grew silent once more. When they finally stopped, deep in a grove of cottonwoods, miles away from the bloodshed, they were no longer just survivors. They were fugitives from both sides. Eliza knelt beside Kaelo, her hands once soft from a life of needlepoint and prayer now steady and capable, as she tore strips from her skirt to bind his wound. He watched her, his chest heaving, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of pain and profound pride. In the quiet of that twilight, the weight of Eliza's choice settled over her. Silas and the Rangers had offered her safety. They offered a return to the whitewashed chapel, the lace curtains, and the gentle hymns of her childhood. They offered a life where she would be safe, but where she would also be invisible. But as she looked at Kaelo, at the man who had protected her when no one else would, she knew that safety was not enough. Staying with him meant abandoning everything she had ever known: her family, her history, her world. It meant danger. It meant exile. Yet, as she pressed her hand against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin and the steady beat of his heart, she felt a pull she could not resist. She realized that the peace she had found in this wild, untamed place was worth more than the comfort of a cage. She had learned the most profound lesson of all. Love is not a chain. It is a choice. Eliza sat back, wiping the dust from her face, and looked out over the endless plains. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been captured in the snow, trembling at the sight of a painted face. That girl was gone. In her place sat a woman who had discovered the depths of loyalty and courage. She took Kaelo's hand. He didn't pull away. He didn't need to speak. They were partners now, equals, united in purpose and in heart. They would face whatever challenges came next: the encroaching settlers, the harsh winters, the life of the hunted together. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and amber, Eliza whispered her truth to the wind. I was lost in the silence of my old life. But here, in the wild, I have finally been found. And that, my friends, is where we leave Eliza and Kaelo, not at the end of their story, but at the beginning of their freedom. I hope this tale of courage and the unexpected paths of the heart resonated with you today. It's a reminder that sometimes The life we are meant to live is waiting for us on the other side of our greatest fears. I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Eliza made the right choice, leaving her family for a life of uncertainty, or is love simply worth the risk? Please share your feelings in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And tell me, where are you listening from today? Whether you're enjoying your morning coffee in Ohio, winding down for the evening in Texas, or joining us from halfway across the world, we are so grateful to have you as part of our community. If this story touched you, please leave a like. Share it with a friend who loves a good Western romance. And don't forget to subscribe to the Dust Trail channel for more stories from the frontier. Until next time, keep your heart open and your spirit wild.